I'm Dan Barth. Today on Americana on Tour, we journey with a wagon train across the famous Oregon Trail. Pioneers beginning their 2,000-mile trek west from points such as Nauvoo, Illinois, or St. Louis, Missouri, traveled several months over landscape similar to this. Well, Bob, the trail changed in 2.5 months. What were some of the problems that the pioneers faced when they reached this part of the country?
Well, one problem was they got out into this country on those big trails like the Oregon Trail, where so many people had crossed before. They started running out of feed along the trail. You've had thousands of wagons cross before and all the livestock it took to pull those. And then they stop in the camps and they take the stock out at night to feed. And after enough people did that, the grass was used up near the camps and the trail. And they'd have to keep taking the stock out a little farther every night to feed. And that became more and more dangerous as the farther away they got from camp, the easier it was for Indians to run the stock off, and that caused real problems. So, and then also the firewood would get depleted. They'd have to use buffalo chips or anything they could get. And there's even accounts of that where Indian camps were in places. The Indians would use up the firewood and the grass for their horses, and they'd move on and leave the place completely used up. So that was a real problem in crossing the plains. The ones that came later had very little feed for their stock and very little firewood and so forth.
As time went on, the Oregon Trail became more and more sparse.
That's right. And so that was it was a tough place.
Well, Bob, on the Oregon Trail, the pioneers had really not as much problem with Indian fights as they did with their own hazards, their own perils, right?
Well, I believe that's true. The Indians took their toll, but nevertheless there were accidents, there were all kinds of dangers along the trail. One of the major ones was crossing those rivers. You can imagine crossing some of the big rivers with those wagons and making simple ferries to get across. Many people drowned. They'd go for miles and miles oftentimes with no water, and then sometimes the water they did find was poisonous, arsenic or alkali or other minerals in there. And you really needed good guides on your wagon train, your wagon bosses that had a knowledge of the country to know where to avoid that bad water, where the water was good, where the crossings were best.
Alkali, the silent killer. The white substance you see around the pool here was often the last mistake of a pioneer on the Oregon Trail. Taken in small amounts, alkali water was not even harmful enough to make you sick. But accumulated dosages over a period of time would prove fatal. Travelers stopping in this area usually replenish their water supplies at Pacific Springs. A few days later, many travelers unsuspectingly watered their stock at a place called the Tanks near South Pass. These were pools of water with naturally occurring arsenic, and within 2 or 3 days, the stock would die. There were accounts of over 150 dead oxen at one watering hole along the Oregon Trail. After several days without water, many travelers found an alkali pool like this one, and in desperation would take a chance, drink the water, and try to keep going.
Other accidents along the trail, anything could happen. You could there's kids that be runaways and run over, and accidental gunshots. A lot of those people were not really, even though it was pioneer days, a lot of them that came out here were not experienced riflemen, and they'd have the guns because they thought they needed them for protection, which they did, but they were a little careless. Sometimes they'd lay a wagon in a wagon box, and they'd reach in to get it by the barrel, and the hammer, if it's got a cap on it, the hammer would flip just enough to fire the cap, and the gun would go off, and there's a number of incidents of accidental deaths that way. But there are just so many ways things can happen that there were graves all along the trail. They say that Well, they were just thousands of graves lined the Oregon Trail in all the years it was used. And a lot of those were right in the ruts of the trail. They said they'd dig the grave in the trail, fill it up, and the wagons would go over the top, and the Indians couldn't find the graves, because quite often they dig the bodies up to get the cloth and the buttons and whatever there was they could salvage for their own use.
Wagon masters were often unscrupulous, and it was important to sign on with a reputable outfit to save your life. And for this, you always paid a good fee. Even so doing, there were reports of entire parties being left stranded.
Most of the people in the enlisted Army were, about 90% of them were foreign-born, and the same with the laundresses. Irish was about 50% of that, and this was a good way to come west. You wouldn't have enough money perhaps to be a member of a wagon train, but if you got out here with the Army, then after the 5-year enlistment, if you chose to, you could go ahead and take your discharge and set up homesteading, things of that type.
But Laundress Wells, can you tell us the average cost that a person would have paid to travel by wagon train to the west?
Oh, I'd have to make conjecture, but I would think close to $1,000, $150 just for the wagon alone. You would need at least 2.5 draft teams in order to alternate your animals, and that might be another couple of $100. And then provisions for an entire year, because you wouldn't have enough time to make a crop by the time you came out. It would not be a poor man. You would have to sell the farm and take all of your profits just to make the 1 year, and then work and hope that you had a good year. To go west. To go west.
So the immigrants traveling by wagon were not the poor from the east?
No, no. Only in the case of Army would they be able to get out here on nothing, and then perhaps get a start in homesteading. But a wagon train, it took a good bit of money, and many of the memoirs indicate close to $1,000, a life savings.
Was the wagon master ever paid a fee up front from all the people in that train?
Yes, I think many diaries, in fact there are records in Salt Lake that indicate that oftentimes he would be paid up front and then not really provide the service that had been promised, and they would stop in district court, a federal district court at Salt Lake, and say, hey, we're not getting what we paid for.
So the wagon train, the Oregon Trail, was not a non-profit venture?
Not to the wagon train leaders, no.
Right.
No.
That's an important point we didn't have. Compared to the average traveling wagon on the plains, this would have been a Rolls Royce, and not every pioneer would have had the financial means to afford such passage. Well, thanks for having us back, Bob. We're standing here next to this wagon, and this is probably the more typical pioneer wagon, isn't it?
Yes, this is more typical, especially of this region. You know, the Conestogas were a big, expensive wagon, and most people couldn't afford that. They'd end up using their farm wagons and whatever wagons they could get to come west. And before the Civil War, there were first both Conestoga and square box wagons like this, and those wagons had mostly linchpin axles. And after the Civil War, it seemed like that transition came about, and like these wagons, they've got the square nut on the end of the axle to hold the wheel on. But when this country was settled in the Bighorn Basin of northwest Wyoming, it was all after 1878, which is quite late, really, in the scheme of things. And almost all the wagons that came into this region where we are were this type of wagon. The settlers and all the different types of people that moved in here were basically using these wagons like this.
When I was growing up, I learned a lot by watching my dad.
Important landmarks were established. When wagon train scouts would spot Chimney Rock, they knew they were only 1 or 2 days from Fort Laramie and supplies and safety. near Scottsbluff, Nebraska, Chimney Rock, the most famous landmark on the Oregon Trail stands. The landmark was used by trappers and traders before the Oregon Trail and by the immigrants after, and marked the one-third way to the Pacific coast. Recently, the height of the monument has been endangered by lightning strikes, the last strike costing it 17 feet in height.
As far as the immigrants passing through here at Fort Laramie, they did have some problem with immigrants stealing horses and different other materials. But I think that really, from my reading, they did get along fairly well. But really, they weren't here for very long. About July 4th, they would be here, and then they would be passing on because they didn't want to get caught in the mountains with the winter months.
In the living history of America, Fort Caspar was an important site along the Oregon Trail. And here at Fort Caspar, we have with us the museum director, Rick Young. Rick, I want to thank you very much for being on the program. And can you tell us the importance of Fort Caspar and a little bit of the early history?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Essentially, the history of the trail that you're interested in started long before Fort Caspar was here. This particular area, people traveling along the Platte River, along the Oregon and also the California, the Mormon Trail, all of those traveling along the Platte River, by the time they got to this area where the fort's eventually constructed, where the city of Caspar grew up, known as the last crossing, as the Platte River takes a turn straight south. So if you want to continue to go west, you need to get across the river, and then you're moving towards the Sweetwater River where Independence Rock is. We also have the Bozeman Trail nearby, Bridger Trail, Pony Express came through here, Overland Stage for a short time, Transcontinental Telegraph came through here, which is the reason the Army was here, to keep the telegraph lines open between the East Coast and California. Their role was primarily keep those telegraph lines open. So we have Platte Bridge Station. There's also a number of others along the way. Deer Creek, Sweetwater Station, St. Mary's, Three Crossings. A number of posts just like this to keep the telegraph open. Fort Laramie was the headquarters for these posts. Whenever the Army closed this post, since it was so new and building materials are scarce, they salvaged most of what they could use. They took those materials down to present-day Douglas and used it to construct Fort Fetterman. Fort Fetterman's located along the Bozeman Trail. A change in emphasis was made. Bozeman Trail became more important as we've got the Transcontinental Railroad just about to be completed, and just a trail moving towards the gold fields in Montana. So now we have Fort Fetterman, we've got Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith located along the Bozeman Trail. Also a short history. Treaty of 1868, the Army decided or agreed with the Indians that you'll have this territory north and we'll pull the forts out.
In 1863, gold was discovered at Alder Gulch, and Virginia City, Montana developed right after that. And then the gold rush was on to Montana, and John Bozeman set up a trail on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains right through the Sioux and Cheyenne Indian hunting country. And from the very start, they were in battles with the Indians. It was a dangerous trail, and so Jim Bridger decided to establish a trail through the Bighorn Basin on the west side of the Bighorn Mountains to avoid the danger of the Indian country. So in the spring of 1864, he left the Platte River with 60 wagons and 300 people and started to establish a trail and building the trail as they went right across what was thought to be impassable country. And he actually got through to Virginia City by July 10th, building trail, building ferry boats out of cottonwood logs to get wagons across the Bighorn Yellowstone River. Got the miners up there and made one return trip back to Fort Laramie, got another party in the late summer, and started again for Virginia City. They got as far as Bozeman, Montana, where Bozeman is now, on December 18th, where they got snowed in by deep snow. But the miners went on with their saddle horses and got into Virginia City that winter. But here was Bridger, almost 60 years old, made these 2 trips, probably close to 2,000 miles, wagon trail, building trail, and getting these people through. That's quite a remarkable feat. And the Bridger Trail was definitely the safest trail. Many travelers used it after that. The biggest drawback was the grass was not as good on this side of the mountain, and many travelers still used the Bozeman Trail until it was finally closed in 1868, and the Indians burned the forts along the trail at that time.
In the weeks to come, we will step back in time at Living History Farms, Des Moines, Iowa, and chat with the general storekeepers and the town doctor, and witness the evolution of farm life from pioneer times to the present. We will venture to the Old West, where the series will take you to abandoned gold mines and try our hand at panning for the elusive metal which drove so many to despair. We will visit the most significant military sites along the famous Oregon Trail for a glimpse of the everyday life of the people stationed there and the exploits of pioneers passing by on their way west. We will take you behind the bars of the frontier prisons to discover their role in the taming of the West and spend several enjoyable hours with our old friend Bill Cody for a personal glimpse of his world-famous grandfather, Colonel William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Other episodes include a look at frontier entertainment featuring a performance at the restored Atlas Theater in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a visit to the Wind River Reservation for a look at the blending of Native American culture and European religion at their Episcopal mission, and a talk with mountain men for an inside view of the Rocky Mountain fur trade and its influence on the exploration of the West. We thank you for allowing us to introduce our series, and we invite you to watch as we bring the living history of Americana on tour into the homes of America. Thanks for watching us, folks. The success of our program depends on you, the home viewer. If you have comments or questions about our program, please write me in care of Americana on Tour, Congerville, Illinois, 61729. We'll see you next week. That's Americana on Tour, Congerville, Illinois, 61729. Bob, in the movies, the pioneers always rode in the wagons. Now, what's the real story on this?
Well, according to many accounts, the people when they came west, they had all their possessions loaded in these wagons, and they were packed right at the top, you know, canvas covers. And at night, it'd be pretty unhandy to actually take all that out and to sleep in the wagon. So in most cases, they hung a canvas down off the side and slept underneath the wagon or some other temporary tent or lean-to shelter in those camps. And also, you know, stories of the trails, the Oregon Trail and others, they usually started out taking more than they really could get to their destination. And they said all along the trails there was trunks and furniture and various things left behind, which the Indians came in and gathered up and broke up for material to make various things they wanted, and cloth and so on, and bits of metal to make arrow points. So a lot of things were left behind just because of the weight once they got out into this rough country. But it was a pretty tough life, you know, circling wagons at night and sleeping under them and getting up, getting everything going in the morning. It's a lot different than the movies sometimes show. One reason they circled the wagons was not always to make a fort, but sometimes if they were in dangerous Indian country, they circled the wagons to make a kraal for their livestock at night, because there was always big danger of the Indians driving off their stock, and if they had their oxen driven off, they were afoot way out in the middle of the wilderness, and they just couldn't have that if they could help it.
In this 1912 silent film made by the Buffalo Bill Historical Picture Company, we see a wagon train journey recreated for the camera by Colonel Cody. We can accept this as a fairly accurate portrayal because Buffalo Bill stressed authenticity when recreating the Old West, and being a former wagon train scout, was very familiar with the genuine conditions. As we see here, some folks walked with the animals along the hot, dry, dusty trail.
Despite Hollywood's frequent depictions of Indian attacks on wagon trains, the traveler of the western migration was more apt to die at the hands of Mother Nature. But forts placed strategically along the important trails helped to allay the fears of immigrants and encourage settlement in the West. As the western migration expanded, vast numbers of settlers sought new lands in the West. In 1888, commissioners were sent from Washington to buy some 900 million acres of land back from the Native Americans. When they came up empty-handed, Washington sent General George Crook to negotiate a deal, a man whom they knew to have the Indians' trust, for $1.50 an acre. Crook's tactic was to convince the Indians that if they did not agree to sell the land, it would be taken from them anyway. Crook told the council, "The white men in the East are like birds. They are hatching out their eggs every year, and there's not enough room in the East, and they must go elsewhere. And they come west, as you have seen them coming for the past few years. And they are still coming, and will come until they overrun all this country, and you can't prevent it. Everything is decided in Washington by the majority. And these people come out west and see that the Indians have a big body of land they're not using, and they say, 'We want the land.'" Many were swayed by his argument, but Sitting Bull's opposition still threatened the sale. So Indian agent James McLaughlin organized a meeting without Sitting Bull's knowledge. McLaughlin swayed Sioux spokesman John Glass in favor of the sale, and Glass' speech at the meeting was enough to pull the remaining votes. Shortly after the meeting, a newspaper reporter asked Sitting Bull how the Indians felt about giving up the land. "Indians," he shouted, "there are no Indians left but me."
The story of the American West couldn't be complete without including the Oregon Trail. Here in eastern Wyoming, the Oregon Trail exists in possibly its most clear detail. These ruts were carved by the wagon wheels through solid rock, and from the 1840s through the 1860s, a multitude of passengers crossed this country to the Pacific coast riding those wagons. The journey that once took months to complete can now be accomplished in a matter of days. Today's modern highways make it hard for us to appreciate the legacy left behind by those early travelers on the famous Oregon Trail. Join us next week for another episode of Americana on Tour.